The following is a lecture by Ethan Pierce, hosted by the AI and the Liberal Arts Initiative. Scan the QR codes on screen to learn more, or go to www.liberal-arts.ai.
AI and the Liberal Arts Learning and Discussion Series. And today we have a conversation that's focused around, we're going to touch on a few things, AI and kind of making accessible learning tools, as well as reading and critical reading, and how AI is working through some of that. We have Ethan Pierce with us today. He's the founder of a startup called Adaptive Reader, and they're using AI in conjunction with humanities teachers, sort of real on-the-ground educators to create scaled texts to basically help high school classrooms meet all the students' needs kind of in a similar place. He'll tell us much more in much more detail. And so Ethan's going to tell us about his work and some of the ways he's using AI to kind of open up the world of literature to a variety of students. And after his presentation, we will welcome Jaya Kannan and Kristina Reardon to have some discussion around, some of the challenges and opportunities with this process. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ethan Pierce of Adaptive Reader.
Thank you all so much for having me. I'm really excited for the conversation today. I've been telling people that I'm on a listening tour, and it feels very true. I think in this age of AI, so much of it is about being in open dialogue constantly and getting feedback. So really excited to get this perspectives of everyone here, thinking about how we can use these technologies now to help students. So I wanted to share a little bit about my background. That's me. And at the end of third grade, I was really good at growing giant pumpkins. I think my biggest one was 403 pounds.
Wow.
I was very impressed by that. I was less great at reading or spelling. I failed every spelling test I ever took. And then somehow, even though I got the lowest score you could possibly get on the SAT writing, because I still haven't learned how to spell, I managed to get into Harvard, and they even let me graduate. So I have been coming at this question of AI, and for me, it always comes back to this recognition that if things had gone a little differently, if a couple of teachers hadn't stepped in along the way to help support me in closing some of those gaps and learning to overcome some of those challenges that I could have had a very different life. And we see this still all the time. So I'm from Maine. Portland High School in Maine has 53 languages spoken in the classroom. So you have kids who are, just arrived from Afghanistan. They're fluent in Pashto. That doesn't mean that they've ever had formal education. And for a lot of these newcomers, they haven't. And so how can we use AI to support all students within the classroom and help them unlock that reading comprehension and that critical skill thinking and skill building, regardless of their sort of linguistic or neurological differences. And that brings us to Adaptive Reader. So we've been working on this since last July, and Adaptive Reader translates novels and textbooks into 90 languages and 3 different reading levels. So we're making those available as print-on-demand paperbacks. So this is a copy of our 6th grade version of the Scarlet Letter right here. We're also introducing next generation audiobooks, and then we also have our digital reader. So I think the core here is this idea that language shouldn't be the barrier to comprehension within these classrooms. And this comes from somebody who studied art and art history in college, and craft is something that I love and care really deeply about. And so when I look at, Mary Shelley's original words over here, on the left, there is something beautiful and poetic about that prose. And what we're doing is not diminishing that at all. In fact, we really encourage educators to ground classroom instruction in close readings of that original text. where they're able to scaffold every student to that. But for a student who has had learning differences or challenges or not had the opportunities to engage with English language texts, adapted texts that retain the meaning and allow them to fully understand the story and the concepts behind it, give them a chance to engage with what's happening and come to the class ready to participate in those critical thinking discussions. So I think a big thing for us here is the ability to synchronize this content across mediums and across languages. So you'll see the paperbacks over there on the left, and then this is our digital reading tool on the right. And just to sort of emphasize, teachers love this dual view. So for any given passage, you can look at the original version of the text. You can bring it down 3 grade levels on the right, or 6 grade levels on the right, or you can translate it into Pashto for that Afghan student, or Spanish, or Haitian Creole, and they can use the strength of that first language, that bilingual superpower, if you will, to access the content and use that to decode the English language text. So just to talk a little bit about our core principles and how we're thinking about this problem, I think a big part of it is text integrity. We're really careful to never redact or take out challenging content from these texts. I think we want to try to stay true to the author's meaning and intention. And the objective here is really dignified differentiation. So I can personally tell you, as someone who was in those IEP programs and got pulled out of class, like education is very much a psychological thing, right? And so how can we make sure that each student can have these supports, these differentiated materials, without feeling the sense of shame that comes with being given something that clearly looks very different from every other student. So like one thing that we do, every one of our books has the exact same cover. It doesn't say that this is the Urdu version or this is the one that's adapted 6 grades down. You have to actually look inside the book to see that. And so there's little things that we can do from a design perspective to make sure that every student is able to preserve their dignity within this social space. And these invisible supports that can sort of help scaffold them up. Flexible formatting, right? So the ability to add discussion talks for students that could benefit from that. The ability to print books with large type for students with vision disabilities. As well as the ability to have audio, print, and digital. One thing and we'll see how well it can play from my phone here. This is purely for demo purposes, Leo, if you're listening. We trained a model on Leonardo DiCaprio's voice. One of the first books that we translated was The Great Gatsby. And so he played Gatsby, and I was like, okay, let's do something to show the power of large language models to create highly differentiated, but really powerful and human voices. So this may or may not be very loud, but if you listen listen really carefully, you can hear Leo AI reading.
We walked into a pretty room with big windows on each end. The windows were open, and the sunlight made the room glow. The breeze blew, making the curtains flutter and swing in the wind.
And he can do that in accentless Mandarin. So I think, the dream for me is that we can print the Scarlet Letter with Urdu on one side, and the teacher can say, oh, let's print it in 6th grade English over here. So they can really move across the two. And let's add a dyslexia font for that student, and then they can scan the QR code in the back and listen in Pashto maybe they didn't have that formal education, they still aren't reading at grade level in that first language, but the capacity to build understanding and build confidence, and then use the understanding that you have to be able to decode this new English language that you're just starting to grapple with, that feels really powerful. Scaffolding up. So I think at the core of this is this idea that by the time you get to high school, even by the time you get to middle school, we've often shifted from learning to read to reading to learn. And every one of these students, when they come to the classroom, is at their own point in the journey, both on their reading comprehension journey, which also involves vocabulary building, as well as their individual developmental journey. So the content that they may be developmentally prepared for, and the content that is accessible to them from a reading comprehension perspective, can often be really different. And so how do we make sure that all students are able to access the developmentally appropriate content for them? So we heard from one educator, for example, like, I'm giving my 10th grade kids like the boxcar children, because that is where their reading level is at, but that content is not developmentally appropriate for them, right? So how do we adapt developmentally appropriate, high interest materials that allow them to fully participate curricularly into language that's accessible, while also making sure from a rigor perspective that we're constantly exposing those students to the grade level text, to that original material, so that they're starting to understand and see themselves being able to access that. There's an educational theory called the zone of proximal development that's really at the core of this, and you can think of it as like a bullseye in the center ring. That's really what these adapted versions is, and that's what the student is able to access independently on their own without supports. The next ring out is what they're able to access with the help of a teacher. And so when you come to the class, we really encourage our teachers, like, everyone read the original language. Like, read Mary Shelley's original words with the educator there to help you through that complicated, antiquated vocabulary and complex sentence structure. But also make sure that you're able to reference that version that you've read that's accessible, so that you can understand what's happening and confidently participate in the classroom discussion. That comes to student agency as well. So this was a really interesting thing. We've done 85 user research interviews with educators and interventionists over the past year to really understand the needs of their students and how they're thinking about the classroom. And this was one thing that really came out. It's like that kid from Afghanistan who speaks Pashto, you shouldn't automatically assume that they get a Pashto book or that they want a Pashto book just because that is the language that they speak at home. So making sure that there's student agency, the student has a voice in saying, okay, actually I'm ready for the gold level. I'm ready to challenge myself to that. Or, saying, I need an easier version in English to help me access and understand this, but I'm working on progressive. Give me both so that I can work together on them. And then quality control. And this one's really important, especially in this age where these large language models are prolific, they're everywhere, and it doesn't always lead to really high quality content. So for our leveled English text, we actually hire educators who have taught the material in the classroom before. So we use 7 different literacy indexes, like who's familiar with lifestyle level? Anyone? So there are these different metrics that we use to assess the reading ease or reading difficulty level of these texts. So they all measure the content in different ways. So our application uses 7 different indexes, the Gunn Fog and question gate scores, to assess the initial level of the text, and then to help us see whether or not we're hitting our goals, which is typically we we try and offer 2 levels below the original text. The first one, we bring it down 3 grade levels, and the second one, we bring it down 5 to 6 grade levels. And so we'll hire folks who have taught that in the classroom before to go through passage by passage and make sure that we are maintaining the sort of critical elements of the original text, and that we're hitting that more accessible language that we're aspiring to. So trying to make sure that we're able to maintain quality control in both our English language texts and our translations. So we have just launched the ability for students to read this in their home languages, which you saw, and so we are working as well on hiring native language speakers to go through and read those texts and edit them, and trying to find the medium there where NYC Public Schools, for example, has 151 languages spoken in their classrooms, and actually they think that's a significant underestimation because of the number of students who speak an indigenous language that are just bucketed under Spanish or under, right? So how do we find a balance in this new world between making sure that we're able to reach all of those students and give all of those students access to materials that are written in their first language, and finding the quality controls and scaling that human capacity. So the last thing that I'll sort of leave with before I'm really excited to have a conversation are just a few of the challenges and opportunities that we see in this space. I think one of them is very much an implementation perspective, and that goes for any tool, right? And it comes down to pedagogy and how these materials are being distributed in the classroom, and so like one of those is how do we make sure that educators are supporting every student to move up the ladder, right? We don't want students to be stuck at that bottom rung where they're constantly using that heavily adapted text and not progressing in their learning level. And so, while at the same time, and we hear this again and again from our educators, is how do we make sure that we help support them in moving along without compromising that student agency perspective? Because we do hear loud and clear from the educators that we've interviewed, like, if you don't give the student agency to go and select that on their own, and you just give them the original text, they're not going to come to you and ask you for an easier version. And so those are some of the students that sort of get lost along the way. So how do you balance that agency and student dignity with also making sure to gently guide them to more rigorous texts? I spoke a little bit about quality control. Some of the really cool things from my perspective, we have a school system in South Dakota where they are dual language in English and Lakota. And so we built a model testing our ability to translate these texts into Lakota for those students. And so as we get more and more of these more and more diverse languages, I really want to be able to support those indigenous languages and really craft these for each student. So how do we balance that quality control again? As a very small young company, we're 9 months old. I don't know if I mentioned that. It's babies. But how do we balance access with ensuring there's quality control? The culture wars, has anyone heard of them? So, we have had questions about, well, some of these books that are banned in certain places, can we take out the content that makes them banned? That's not something that we do. I will say from our editorial standards, in our level versions of our text, we do not use racially charged or racial slurs. We don't use profane language. I don't think that's necessary within our adaptations. But we keep the original as is, and we put those disclaimers on there. But we don't remove any scenes or any pieces of the plot or content that make it controversial, because I think those are central to grappling with the text in that classroom setting and understanding why it's challenging. But as we think about how other technology companies will find their own approaches to that, I think it's a challenging area for all of us to think about as content becomes infinitely personalizable. And then enabling equity. Again, and I think this is the core of all of this. How do we make sure that we balance equity and diversifying this content to make it just right for each student, while also making sure that we're not leaving students behind by not lifting them up. Thank you guys so much.
So now I'd like to invite Jaya and Kristina up. Maybe if we do you guys want to sit in these chairs over here? So we're going to let some conversation happen with Jaya and Kristina, and then turn it over to the audience to also ask questions.
Hi, I wanted to start by thanking you for such a great presentation. I knew what you were going to present, and I'm familiar with the topic, but I was a little concerned about what approach we might take with adaptive reading, and I'm so thrilled to see how you made a very complex picture of it, and you were trying to really understand the many dimensions of the student learning and the challenges for pedagogy, the technology, and all of this. So this is really good. Is it okay if I ask the question? So I was trying to draw this back to the Amherst context. I'm really thankful for how mindful you are about these diverse learners and in the United States, students coming in as immigrants and struggling with language learning. And so in Amherst College, out of the 90% of our students who are domestic, almost half of them self-identify as a person of color. And this is only one of the many dimensions of diversity. And we are very proud about that. But we also are constantly thinking about, when we bring in such students, what should we do as an institution, right, to provide the optimal learning environment. And so if I tie what you showed us now with the adaptive reader, one thing that comes to mind is how to strike this balance between trying to recognize the diverse needs of the students, linking that with Amherst being known for academic excellence and aiming high and rigor, and by using such a model, is there a conflict there?
I think it's
like us wanting students to read difficult texts, and then we are offering them this other option of it. So philosophically, we were wondering whether we could just start there in the conversation.
It's a great question. So I've been in technology for a little over a decade now. The last company I was on the founding team of, I was the head of product for a company called Readly that listened to students read aloud. And then we used AI to compare that against the text that they were supposed to be reading. And so, as part of improving the product, we would listen with teachers to the students reading these texts for homework. And you would have a 10th grade student who spent 10 minutes and got through the whole text with great reading fluency. And then in the same class, you would have a student who struggled for 90 minutes going through that text and missing every third or fourth word, trying to sound it out. And you could tell by the end of that text that they had not understood what was happening there. So I guess sort of for me, and this is also from my personal experience, like I still cannot spell at all. I don't know that I'll ever be able to. Like there's just like something, I use AI constantly. It used to be called spell check. Like these are things that assist. And I guess one of the questions that I have is I don't know that we should have a uniform standard for every student of what success looks like from each of these metrics, and how do we allow each of these students to find their like zone of genius in terms of being able to understand and comprehend the subject material and take their own unique experiences and apply that to approaching the content in a different way. At the same time, I think a lot about how writing for me is this merger of craft and narrative. What we're doing with these texts is that craft part, the language, the rich sort of syntax. We're changing that while trying to maintain the narrative so that students can access that and grapple with that in their own way. But there is something really important about exposing students to that craft, right? Like that's why we love so many of these books. And so I think there's certainly a balance to be struck there of when do we focus on that language and craft, and how do we support those students in this? And also an acknowledgement at some way, which is really hard, that like they all have ChatGPT at home now and can upload any PDF you want to do their own synthesis. So how we thoughtfully provide supports for them, and also acknowledge the things that they may be doing anyway.
Thank you. Yeah, that gives me a lot to think about. One of my questions actually had to sort of deal with the idea that much of this sounds really new, and some of it might not be all that new. So I am thinking back to like approaching a really difficult text in college and realizing, oh my gosh, I can't understand this. I'm gonna go consult the SparkNotes first, and even though I'm a really good student and want to do it, I have to actually, at some point in my first years of college, like I got to read these SparkNotes first, and then I'm gonna go dive into the book and read it. But so I really appreciate the sort of scaffolding that you're offering and talking about in terms of sort of exposing students to one text and then bringing them to the other original text to help them, transition. It's not just one or the other. But I guess I'm wondering, like, in what ways is this really different than SparkNotes, CliffNotes, texts that have been abridged, that have been around for a really long time?
Yeah, great question. So I love sort of bringing it to the historical perspective there. And we've had No Fear Shakespeare, which simplifies Shakespeare text into modern English for a long time, which has been heavily adopted. But even going back 3 or 4 centuries, this was how you learned Latin and Greek. Like you would get a book, and on one side it would be in Greek, and the other side it would be in Latin. And so you used what you knew in each of those languages to help decode the other. And so there's been a long history of this sort of thing, as well as with sort of simplifying texts to help you understand them first. I think with SparkNotes, for example, it is truly just a summary. And what I would say is different about this is these are not summaries of the book. I think you're holding the 6th grade version of Great Gatsby right here. I think it's still like 140 pages or something. It's like you're still practicing that. It's not just you're not being told, okay, here are the 3 themes, and this in 2 sentences is what happened in chapter 1. You're still practicing that art of reading and deciphering for yourself through the plot, like what those character developments are, what's happening. And finally, I think our capacity, our emphasis on always tying this back to the original, and with really intentional design features like our passage markers that allow you to say, okay, everyone, let's go to passage 47, and the kid who's reading it in Vietnamese and the kid who is reading it in Urdu are at the exact same point as the kid who's reading it in the original English, that's a powerful thing.
Yeah, so I'm also fascinated with all these interactions with the technology, and thank you so much for so boldly sharing your own experience. I think that makes it all the more powerful for us to understand. I was trying to see, in using AI, like what is the process behind are you using existing technologies to, like the translation or to arrive at the level of reading? And then it was also interesting how you were using the human in the loop. So if there are 3 teachers going through it, there's also some kind of interlinked reliability. Can you share a little bit more about like what's the process?
Yeah, absolutely. So we built our own core technology that helps us to adapt each of these texts. We plug in 12 different large language models. So you're probably familiar with OpenAI, and they have GPT 3.5 or 4. There are all of these different large language models out there that you can plug in, and then there are also there's a company called DeepL, for example, that really focuses on deep learning for language-specific translation. So there are all of these great pieces of technology out there that you can pull together. And what we do, we try to layer that on top of one another. We actually train large language models to proofread and edit one another to say, okay, like, is this translation into Farsi missing something from the original text? So that level of, and you can do automations as well that aren't AI, but are just like, I think with our human editors, we've identified, I think 16 or 18 common errors that come up in these translations, and so we search for those and we flag them for our editors. So there are ways in which we can build in these automations and build in additional processes from a quality control perspective. And our human in the loop, having these really thoughtful educators come in on top of that is a super important part for us in both making sure that we have quality control for the students, but also figuring out how to improve the technology so that we can scale this for the diversity of texts that are out there and the diversity of student needs.
Another question I have is, a lot of your presentation has been using high schools as an example. And so I'm interested in the difference between the high school learning experience and the college learning experience. And so I think, for example, when students end up at Amherst College, there's an assumption that they have a particular level of reading. That may or may not be true, but I think there is, among many support staff and faculty alike, an assumption that we should expect a certain level of reading. And this goes back to Jaya's question about rigor as well. And so how do you imagine that this sort of adaptive reading could be used in the college context, where perhaps there is or there's an expectation of a higher level of reading than there might be, let's say, in 10th grade English? And relatedly, how would this work beyond the English literature classroom? And so these are all novels so far, or English literature texts I'm seeing. And so, for example, like a lot of students that I work with, in my classes, I don't always assign or don't sometimes ever assign novels, but rather critical articles or informational texts that have different sorts of challenges.
Yeah, really great questions. So I would say, when I was an undergrad at Harvard, even there, I saw like a lot of folks coming to the classroom with significant differences. I remember one of my best friends in undergrad was a blind woman who was studying literature, and I remember running a Kickstarter. Her vision was deteriorating. And to buy her like a $4,000 machine that would help her take those books that she wanted to read and allow content. And so, we within these elite institutions, we have students that are coming with dyslexia, with significant learning differences in very different backgrounds. And so, we've emphasized here definitely from a secondary school perspective the broad range that there can be, but there were some philosophy texts that we read in college that I wish I'd had like an adapted version to go through, because it's about how do we make sure that we can access the core concepts within a text in a way that is legible to us where we're at now, and then use that to be able to decode the more sophisticated language or syntax, whatever it is that's impeding that now. I think to your second point on why we focus on high school content first, we just found a really, high school in the US is where there's the greatest gap between students' reading ability and that developmental readiness that we were talking about earlier. And so it's really a pain point. And so that's where, with our very limited sort of resources, we thought that was a good place to start and try building this technology. We are looking to move into K-12 and support students at different reading levels, as well as, we've had folks from workforce development reach out to us. We had a company that does trains workers for clean tech jobs, and they were like, so many of the folks that come to learn from us are not English language speakers. So can you translate this guide to putting up a wind turbine into the language that's going to allow them to learn those skills, while also making sure that they can communicate with the other people on their team. So I think there's a really cool world out there for that. We're excited to get into core curriculum and textbooks and help existing textbook publishers be able to adapt their content. I think it's an exciting world, but figuring out how we do it well and responsibly is really important.
It's 11:45.
Yeah,
Do you want to open it?
If there's any questions from the audience.
Did you notice any increase in requests for lower level reading post-pandemic?
I think, there demonstrably is a very urgent and clear challenge in reading comprehension and literacy across the United States, globally, really, right now, so many kids lost a lot of learning time and classroom time. And so it's particularly acute right now. I remember I was talking to a chemistry teacher last month, 10th grade chemistry teacher. She was like, I always had one kid every year who was reading at a second grade level. This year I have 12. How am I supposed to help all of those students when taking a science class is really learning a foreign language, right? It's so vocab intensive. But I think one of the biggest changes that we've seen post-pandemic, we found 90%, a little over 90% of the educators we spoke to preferred or strongly preferred paperback to digital for any sort of long format text. And that's a massive shift post-pandemic. There's sort of this pendulum swing. All of this technology was forced upon the classroom, and now there's a reaction to that. Question?
I guess this might be an extremely philosophical question, but how do you predict the nature of interaction and the nature of communication in the United States and like maybe even globally changing as a result of like these emerging, I guess, like comprehension tools? Because I know I'm an Afghan actually, and I came here when I was 11, and if I had access to this like technology, I probably would have been able to preserve my identity a lot better than I have, and would have been able to communicate better in my language, would have been more confident doing that. So how do you feel that that's going to change our like interaction with like language in the United States, where like so many people speak so many like languages and communicate in so many different ways? Sorry, that might be highly philosophical, but
No, I think it's great. It's like highly relevant. I think to the sort of anecdote with the schools in South Dakota being able to preserve not only indigenous languages, any language, right? Like that linguistic heritage. I think that's really a powerful thing, and so that makes me really excited about this. I think sort of talking about it from the inverse, right? How do these tools help us communicate is really powerful too. Talking about craft and narrative earlier, you know, as somebody who like farm boy from rural Maine, I often think that the way we assess someone's intelligence when we're reading an email or reading their writing, right? We use their spelling, their grammar, their vocabulary, the complexity of their sentence structure as stand-ins for intelligence, where often it's much more strongly correlated with class and the opportunities that they've had. And so I think one of the really powerful things about large language models is that it can give folks who haven't had the same opportunities from an educational perspective the opportunity to take that narrative, take that thing that they want to share with the world, and share that in a really powerful way. So hopefully that kind of, those are big questions, so we could spend all day doing that, but great question.
I have a question about the student agency piece. Using the text scaled versions or cross languages, that's a very different kind of learning and a different kind of classroom experience for a lot of students who have, maybe found the classroom to be a hopeless place where they're not in the driver's seat and they're not able to say, oh, I'm getting this, or they're not, or they're embarrassed to say that I'm not understanding this. I'm wondering first how, I'd just love to hear more about how you sort of train teachers to deal with that new kind of sort of empowered learning experience. And then also if in any of the conversations you've been having with students or teachers, if you found that sort of seeping into other classes where they're able to feel more empowered to ask questions and to say, I'm reading this doesn't make any sense, can you help me, sort of say that. I'm just curious to hear what people are saying and how that, it's just such a different classroom experience to really be the driver of your learning. I don't think we encourage that enough anymore.
Yeah, really great question. I think the first thing that I would say is our teachers are there already, like in so many of these classrooms. I went in thinking that, I went in thinking this was going to be a purely digital tool, and through that iterative process of asking questions and understanding how teachers were engaging in the classroom, that's how we landed on paperbacks. We still have the digital offering, but one of the other things that I came in thinking was that, it was going to be really important for teachers to assign specific levels to students and sort of lock them into that and try and push them to grow. And it was the teachers who really, showed me, told me loud and clear that the importance of student agency within that. So it's not universal, but I think teachers already know this. And I think as we, especially these high school teachers, as they're preparing kids to go out and enter the working world or enter university, they know that they need to take some of the training wheels off and make sure that they're allowing kids some agency to start taking control of their own learning process, or it's going to be really hard once they're just completely gone.
Are you thinking about integrating the standards you mentioned for assessing reading level into the language models, into language models?
Yeah, great question. So currently our language translations are all based on our silver edition, which is typically 4 to 6 grades below grade level. We made that choice really intentionally after a lot of discussion with teachers, because right now we don't have the capacity as an organization or as a team to do multiple reading levels in each of the languages. So that was like a trade-off. We do want to get there where for each of these languages you can read it at that original sort of reading level, which often has very archaic language, or read it at one of our in one of the leveled text formats. But what we heard from educators was that, a lot of these students, the most vulnerable ones in particular, those newcomers, especially folks in refugee resettlement programs, they may not have had the opportunity to reach grade level reading in their first language. And so we came at it from a place of accessibility first and foremost, where the first goal is to make sure that that student is able to access their content. But I think we would definitely like to get to the point where we're able to offer this sort of level text in our language translations too. Question?
Yeah, I have 2 questions. The first is, it's a minor anecdote, but I learned how to bike when I was a freshman in college. And the reason was when I was younger, I was too scared to take the stabilizers off. And so my question here is, what would teach the student how to read here at a really high level instead of just always relying on the stabilizers, right? Of increasing the level. Like, I think someone touched on this a little bit, but the struggle of not understanding the text, asking your professor and talking to your friends and maybe even asking ChatGPT today is part of the learning process of digesting deeper meaning of text, right? When you read a word like ingenious versus like just clever, some different meaning is there. And so where do you see that balance happening between a teacher just being like, hey man, I don't have enough time for all these students, just give them the easier level. And for example, another teacher who's like, okay, you've done so much of the silver level, it's time to get you up to gold. Where do you see that balance happening?
I think that there's a real equity question that's happening right now. Level texts aren't new. There's a company called Newsella that's been doing rewriting news articles at multiple reading levels since about 2012. They're in 90% of K-12 classrooms. So they've seen a lot of adoption, and I think one thing that we hear from a diversity and equity perspective is that, unfortunately, there has been something that has happened where these students were always given below grade level texts and weren't encouraged to, and that is a real problem, right? And so I think it's a really great question. It's why, from a pedagogical perspective, we always encourage in-class work to be on the grade level text. So again, with that like zone of proximal development, it's about making sure that the student has something for that independent work. And also just like a sort of asterisk clarification there. Like, I can read really well now, but I'm a really slow reader. And So there's something there too, right? Like even as someone with a sophisticated vocabulary who can move through very sophisticated texts, that doesn't mean that equity necessarily is having me read exactly the same text as up here. So I think there are multiple ways to look at that question, but it is really important that we expose every student to that grade level material so that they can also see, oh, actually I can understand that. And here are the things that made that text hard for me to understand, and to see a path to being able to work with that text themselves. And did you have a second question?
Yeah, I did. I just didn't want to take up like the room. My second question is, you mentioned that there are some things such as profanity or like inappropriate language that gets removed, and I'm curious who or what process or methodology gets to determine which words and sentences stay, which are like don't touch the meaning, which gets removed. Is it the company? Is it the school administrators? The class educators? Who decide what goes in and what kind of goes out?
So in general, I would say in the models we've built, we like the settings are that like we won't replicate profane language inherently, but we also go through that process from an editorial perspective. I think actually The Great Gatsby, one thing that came up, which was really interesting, is there's a title of the book referenced that uses a very racially charged word. And so our whole editorial team spent a lot of time, because it's very intentionally referenced to call out specifically that this character, is not aligned from a news perspective. Like they're to call out that challenge. And so how do we preserve the meaning and intention there? And how do we think about that language within the classroom? And that was like a very hard conversation. I don't know if there's a perfect answer to that. We opted to reference it in a different way without replicating that language. But it's still connected to the original. We did not redact it from the original version of the text. And so we used content disclaimers to let educators know that that is still there.
Any last questions? We're just about at time.
I just have one tiny last question. It's been so interesting as someone who does a little bit of translation work here and there to hear you speak about this really as a process of translation in many ways. And maybe just as a final kind of question or comment, I'm curious about the sorts of just theorizations of translation that you may have discussed with your editorial team, specifically human editors. Like, are you looking at different theories of translation and sort of what that looks like on the page?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think like one thing that I want to emphasize is that like this isn't. I think that there's still very much a place for really high quality. There's an art to translation, and there are people who have dedicated their lives to that, and they're able to take one of these pieces of literature and do it at like a justice that we don't have the capacity to. I think for our translations, we really try and emphasize understanding or comprehension within them, and sometimes we certainly try to, from a grammatical perspective, we try and really match that content on the English side. But there's like a poetry to the prose when you have somebody with really a mastery of that language who's able to go in, and there's always going to be a place. And we as a company, I don't think we have made the very conscious decision that that is not what we're doing here. We're not aspiring to that level of translation. I don't think that we can, while also trying to include the diversity of languages, which is really important to our mission. So that's how, I'm not sure if that fully answers your question.
Well, thank you so much to all of our guests today. This was a really great conversation, and yeah, we'll be sharing the video and circulating it widely. So thank you for your time and for sharing your work, Ethan and Jaya and Kristina. Thank you so much for engaging in conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to meet you all.